So, properties of rhombi and squares. So, a rhombus is a parallelogram with all four sides congruent. And so, a rhombus has all the properties of a parallelogram plus two additional characteristics. So, we already know that a parallelogram has opposite sides that are congruent, opposite sides that are parallel, diagonals that bisect each other. And so, now we're adding two more characteristics in order to have a rhombus. So if a parallelogram is a rhombus, then its diagonals are perpendicular. So this is rhombus ABCD. The diagonals are perpendicular, so AC is perpendicular to BD. If a parallelogram is a rhombus, then each diagonal bisects a pair of opposite angles. So NQ is a diagonal. Well, NQ bisects angle 5 and angle 6, and it also bisects angle 7 and angle 8. And then PR is a diagonal. It bisects angle 1 and angle 2, or bisects to create angle 1 and angle 2, and to create angle 3 and angle 4. A square is a parallelogram with four congruent sides and four right angles. So recall that a parallelogram with four right angles is a rectangle, and a parallelogram with four congruent sides is a rhombus. Therefore, a parallelogram that is both a rectangle and a rhombus is a square. And this is where you get that whole a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square that people often say. So the diagonals of rhombus WXYZ intersect at V. If the measure of angle WZX is 39.5, then what is the measure of angle ZYX? So the first thing that it tells us is that this is a rhombus. And so because this is a rhombus, then we know that all the sides are congruent. Okay. And it tells us that WZX is 39.5. So that's this angle. It's going to be 39.5. And we need to find ZYX. So that is this whole entire angle. That's what we're trying to find. So if it's a rhombus, the diagonals bisect each other. So this angle here is also 39.5. So we have 39. That was a delay. 39.5 plus 39.5. So that's 79. So that means that this angle is also 79. So together they are 158. This is a quadrilateral. So the sum of the angles in a quadrilateral is 360. So we're going to do 360 minus 158. We get 102. All right, we get 202. Sorry about that. And then 202, we're going to divide that by 2, and we're going to get 101. So that means that this angle is 101 and this angle is 101. So the measure of angle ZYX is 101 degrees. Okay, next. The diagonals of rhombus WXYZ intersect at V. It tells us that WX is equal to 8x minus 5. So this is, oops, let's go back. Sorry. This is 8x minus 5. And WZ, which is this side over here, is 6x plus 3. We need to find x. This is a rhombus. A rhombus has four congruent sides. So that means that 8x minus 5 is equal to 6x plus 3. So 2x minus 5 equals 3. And 2x equals 8. And x is equal to 4. Next. All right, so here is your Venn diagram for parallelograms. So parallelograms in general, opposite sides are parallel. Then you have rectangles, which have four right angles, and you have rhombi, which have four congruent sides, and you have a square that is both a rectangle and a rhombi. So make sure you definitely look over and study this diagram. All right. So the converse of the diagonals of a rhombi, just simply say that if the diagonals are perpendicular, then it's a rhombus. And the converse of the opposite angles says that if one diagonal of a parallelogram bisects a pair of opposite angles, then the parallelogram is a rhombus. Okay, so consecutive side congruence theorem says that if one pair of consecutive sides of a parallel are congruent, then the parallel is a rhombus. So if you have ABCD here and AB is congruent to BC, then it's a rhombus. You could also have that AB is congruent to AD. That would be the same thing. That would make it also a rhombus. And then the square theorem says that if a quadrilateral is both a rectangle and a rhombus, then it is a square. Determine whether parallelogram ABCD is a rhombus, a rectangle, or a square for ABCD, and it gives you the coordinates. List all that apply and explain. So we already know it's a parallelogram. The specifics of a parallelogram come when we are talking about the diagonals, because if the diagonals are congruent and perpendicular, then that will help us know if it's a rhombus or a square. Because if the diagonals are perpendicular, it can be either. If the diagonals are congruent and perpendicular, it's a square. So we want to look at the length of the diagonals. So first we're going to find BD, and that's going to be the square root of -1 minus 2 squared plus 3 minus a -2 squared. So that's going to be the square root. -1 minus 2 is -3 squared is 9. And 3 minus a -2 is 5 squared is 25. So that's going to be the square root of 31. And then we're going to find AC, which is the other diagonal. So that's going to be the square root of -2 minus 3 squared plus -1 minus 2 squared. So -2 minus 3 is -5, and -5 squared is 25. And then -1 minus 2 is -3, and -3 squared is 9. So that's going to give me the square root of 34. And this one up here should be 34 as well. Okay, so my diagonals are congruent because they're both equal to the square root of 34. So if the diagonals are congruent, then it is a rectangle. So I'm going to write rectangle because the diagonals are congruent. Okay. So next we need to know if the diagonals are perpendicular. Because then if the diagonals are perpendicular, then it's going to be either a rhombus or a square or possibly both. So we need to get the slope of the diagonals. So I'm going to do the slope of BD, and that's going to be 3 minus a -2 over -1 minus 2, which is going to be 5 over -3. And then the slope of AC is going to be 2 minus a -1 over 3 minus a -2, which is going to be 3 over 5. So these are opposite reciprocals. So because they're opposite reciprocals, then that means that the diagonals are perpendicular. So if the diagonals are perpendicular, then it could be a rhombus or a square. So we are going to write both rhombus and square. And there's some other things that we can do to determine if it is a square. We can look at the distance of each of the sides. So how long are each of the sides, to see that they are all congruent. We can also show that two consecutive sides are perpendicular. So if I look, the slope of BC is going to be 1 over -4, and then the slope of CD is going to be 4 over 1, and so those are um, opposite reciprocals, so that would mean this is a right angle, and then this is 1 over -4 as well. So here's a right angle, and it's a parallelogram. Opposite sides are congruent, so those are right angle, or opposite angles are congruent, so those are right angles. So that makes this a rectangle, a rhombus, and a square.